things in Cambridge?
Well, we're in lockdown the way India is, and that's a surreal environment and existence for all of us in both India and the United States. Our country's in deep, deep political and existential crisis, and I think that's what's really gripping all of us right now.
What do you think is going on in the United States? Why are we seeing these images?
In the U.S., we've had a problem of race, of mistreatment of African Americans. Since the beginning of the founding of the country, the first slave ships arrived here in 1619. That's the year before the Pilgrims came from England to settle Massachusetts Bay Colony, where I live now. And you think about our Civil War, fought over slavery. Our greatest, I think, American of the last 100 years is Martin Luther King Jr. He fought battles, peaceful, nonviolent battles. Of course, his idol, his spiritual idol was Mahatma Gandhi.
Yes.
He modeled his movement after the Gandhi movement to liberate India from British rule, the peaceful nonviolence. King led us to become a better country. We elected an African-American president, Barack Obama, a man I deeply respect. And yet you see race come back now. You see African Americans mistreated, this horrible, horrible murder of George Floyd, this young African American man, by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have millions of Americans trying to protest peacefully, as is our right, as is your right in India. And yet the president treats them all like terrorists.
I mean, I think the thing we share, and I think why our partnership works, is because we are tolerant systems. You mentioned that you're an immigrant nation. We are a very, very tolerant nation. Our DNA is supposed to be tolerant. We're supposed to accept new ideas. We're supposed to be open. But the surprising thing is that that open DNA is sort of disappeared. I mean, I say this with sadness that I don't see that level of tolerance that I used to see. I don't see it in the United States, and I don't see it in India.
I think you've identified a central issue, at least for the United States. And the silver lining here, the good news is that we have people demonstrating all across the country in every major city in the United States this week, peacefully, on behalf of tolerance, inclusion, minority rights, all these essential issues at the core of our democracy. And I think one advantage that we democracies have, say, over an authoritarian country like China, is that we can correct ourselves as a self-corrective part of our national DNA in India and the United States. And as all democracies, we resolve this at the ballot box in free and fair elections. We do not turn to violence. We do this peacefully. That's the India tradition that we love about India.
But I feel that this division which occurs is actually tremendously weakening for the country. But the people who do the division portray it as the strength of the country. When you divide African Americans, Mexicans, and other people in the United States, or you divide Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs in India, you're weakening the structure of the country. But then the same people who weaken the structure of the country say that they're the nationalists.
Well, I think that's what President Trump is all about. He wraps himself in a flag. He declares that he alone can fix the problems. I must say, I think President Trump is in many ways an authoritarian personality. But in our country, you're seeing the institutions remain strong. Mm-hmm. The military clearly saying over the last few days, individual senior military leaders, we will not put American military troops onto the streets. That's the function of the police forces, not the military force. We'll abide by the Constitution. The senior military officer, General Mark Milley, said this week, Americans have a right to protest. They have a right to disagree with the government. These are so fundamental. It's extraordinary we have to even debate these. So we're back to debating first principles. But again, I do see strengths that democracies go through trials. We play out our differences in political campaigns or in street protests, but at least we can do that. You can see authoritarianism coming back in China, in Russia. And we democracies, we sometimes go through painful episodes because of our freedoms, but we're so much stronger because of them. That's our advantage, I think, inherently over the authoritarian countries. We are not looking for a conflict with China, but we are waging, in a way, a battle of ideas with China. We can't decouple ourselves or delink ourselves from China. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
I'd say cooperative competition without ever going into violence. Yes, they have a different worldview. Yes, they have an authoritarian worldview. Yes, we have a democratic worldview. And I'm pretty confident that the democratic worldview will do well. But in order to achieve that, that has to start from inside our countries. We can't have a authoritarian perspective internally and then make that argument. That argument has to be made from the foundation of democracy within the country itself, within our countries. And that's where I see the problem, that it becomes very difficult for us to, from our perspective, to make an argument of democracy when our institutions are being torn apart, when our people are scared, when millions of people in our country are terrified of what's going to happen to them. The most important battle, from our perspective, yours and ours, is to actually bring back our countries to where they used to be, which is sort of where we embrace our cultures, where we embrace our past, where we embrace our people, and where we sort of we give a healing touch, as opposed to this sort of aggressive politics that we're stuck in. Why do you think that in this COVID crisis, and I say this for most countries, including India and the United States, why do you think there has been almost no cooperation?
I think you and I have talked about this before. It's a terrible, terrible disappointment to me. I'm sure it is to you. You know, this crisis was made for the G20. It was made for Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump to be working together, all of our countries, for the common global good. All of us are confronted. Every Indian American is vulnerable to this disease. And I would have thought at the beginning of the crisis, I would have predicted that countries would have put down their differences and worked for a vaccine together, or how to distribute that vaccine in an equitable and humane fashion. And it hasn't happened, mainly because Donald Trump doesn't really believe in international cooperation. He's a unilateralist. He wants America to go it alone in the world. And Xi Jinping chose to compete with Trump. And the U.S. and China at the heart of the problem here. And I hope when the next crisis comes, we'll do better to work together in a more effective way.